Over the weekend, private military organization Wagner revolted against Vladimir Putin's government, creating one of the biggest challenges to his regime in decades. The coup failed, but can the Russian president keep a grip on power? Let's bring in Allison Fedirka, who is Geopolitical Futures Director of Analysis, to discuss. Allison, thanks for being here. So this is, at least to the outside world, one of the most direct challenges to Putin's hold on Russia. What sort of happens from here? Is this the last we hear of Wagner? Are there other elements within Russia that could provide future challenges?
So I'll start with that second part. There are other elements that are in Russia that could provide future challenges. These groups have been present since the beginning of the war, and one of the biggest questions in terms of how will this war end came back to what is the situation in Russia going to be like? You had some tension within the top brass in the Ministry of Defense in Kremlin, especially after in the first 2 months back in 2022, the offensive didn't go quite as planned. You had these groups like the Wagner Group coming in to help out. There was tension there in terms of logistics and supplies. And then you also had oligarchs who saw post-sanction a big drop in the amount of money that they had that also made them question Putin or the impact of aligning with Putin would have on their bottom line. So there's several different interest groups in Russia that are paying a price for this war that Putin needs to find a way to manage. Prior to the weekend events, the Kremlin and Wagner Group worked collaboratively. The Wagner Group has been very helpful for the Kremlin in their operations in Africa. And even in fighting in Ukraine, they were the fighting force responsible for a lot of the Russian success that they saw on the battlefield with Ukraine, because a lot of these fighters are very well trained. And they also are very well paid compared to the Russian military. So they have a lot of incentive to keep on fighting. As for where we go from here, the fact that the coup did not work means that Putin is still in power. And it may sound simplistic, but at the end of the day, that means there's enough people in his inner circle, in the government, in the military, that are loyal enough to him that he can remain there. Now, of course, there's always going to be power plays, but as long as he's still in power, then we know kind of where things stand and what he needs to be doing. If we see major reshuffling of military people, if we see social unrest breaking out, if we see any reports of unrest in the military, people being critical, that's when we have a sense of, okay, Putin maybe doesn't have as much control and did not survive this coup as strongly as he might think he did. But he has done a very good job of talking to other foreign leaders, trying to reassure them and things like that. The two other things in terms of the fighting in Ukraine to be mindful of is, one, it's not entirely clear if Wagner will come back and fight with Russia, meaning one of their best fighting forces may not return to the battlefield, which could shift the dynamics there. And then two, this prospect of a negotiated settlement. Once you have something like this happen, people are questioning the staying power of Putin, which makes a negotiated settlement extremely difficult because they want to know that the person they're negotiating with is going to be around and can actually enforce any agreement that people come up with. So until people can be certain that Putin is the man in charge and is the person that they can talk to, the idea of a negotiated settlement with Russia is now just off the table.
Allison, I want to ask you, you said they're very well paid. Who is financing, or where's the financing for the Wagner Group coming from?
So that is a little bit of an opaque answer there. They do some financing of their own in terms of, for example, think of them as a private security firm. And so when they go into places like Africa, you have governments, you have major companies that are going to pay for their security so they can get money that way. There's also patrons among the oligarchs and things like that within Russia that will also give them money as well. But as a private mercenary group, they have a lot of access to black market money as well as financing from their own operations because of the fees that they will put on other people to guarantee things like security.
Allison, why didn't this coup work?
So typically, there's a few things you want to do when you have a coup. One is make sure you have most of the military behind you. And two is gain a hold of all of the communications so that you can be in control of what people are hearing and seeing. And three, I would even say make sure that where you carry out your operation, it has a high level of impact. And we did not see any of those three traits from what the Wagner Group did. The city that they took over in the south, Rostov-on-Don, it's important for grain export, but the power centers of Russia are not there. They are in Moscow. There are some in St. Petersburg. They didn't really go after any of, taking out of the leadership or anything like that. They didn't have a strong response from the military to back them up. In fact, a lot of the military came out and said, please come back to us, started doing security operations around Moscow, starting to do operations to prevent the group from advancing north. And then, of course, they never really bothered to try and get in control of communication, news channels, internet censorship, what have you, so that they can control the narrative and they can structure any type of power takeover before word gets out that that's actually happening.
So, Allison, I'm sorry to interrupt, but so was it really actually a coup attempt, or was there, right? Or was there another goal here that they had in mind in doing this action?
So there's a couple of different theories, I think, that you can make the case that it wasn't necessarily a true coup attempt. One would be that it is a classic example of a Russian deception campaign in terms of trying to create an image of perhaps a weaker Russia, create distraction so that they could move military forces for some type of action in Ukraine. They also needed to find ways to perhaps make Putin look like he's in control. If you say it was a failed coup, he's obviously in control. He looks strong. The angle they had by involving Belarus makes the Belarusian president look strong. He was having problems domestically. So being able to position himself as a negotiator would have helped improve his image, which is important for Russia's overall international relationships. And as for the Wagner Group, he can still find ways to be useful in the war. And so even if, for example, Prigozhin does not, he hasn't really been very public recently over the past, 48 hours, he can still find ways to benefit if, push comes to shove, the fighting continues. His force is too useful and too good not to be included in Ukraine, and he can enjoy that as well.
Allison, could this cause kind of any deepening of a split in terms of ideologies in Russia? For instance, some were not on board with the conflict with Ukraine. How do you see it?
I think the ideology is probably harder to see a split in, and that the question is going to come down more to the impact on daily life that it has. So there were some people that were not on board necessarily with the invasion in Ukraine, but there has been a lot of work going on in Russia in terms of nationalism and using media to get people on board with the war that's going on and the operations that are going on. In addition, there is a lot of education that goes on in Russia that explains Ukraine is part of Russia. Mm-hmm. So there are other people in Russia that genuinely believe Ukraine is territory that is rightfully belonging to Russia. I think where we're going to see a lot of problem in terms of potential political backlash and domestic unrest will be if the economic consequences of this war become so great that people can no longer meet their basic needs, and then they blame the government, who is clearly going to be the party responsible for that.
All right. Allison Fedirka, thank you so much. Geopolitical Futures Director of Analysis. We appreciate you.